So now for Descartes' explanation of what it is to use the faculty of judgment properly. So he writes, these errors, the errors that I get into with my judgments sometimes, depend on the simultaneous concurrence of two causes, the faculty of knowing that is in me and the faculty of choosing, that is the free choice of the will. In other words, simultaneously on the intellect and will. Through the intellect alone, I merely perceive ideas about which I can render a judgment. Strictly speaking, no error is to be found in the intellect when properly viewed in this manner. So you remember earlier, Descartes had looked at what the components of his mind are. You know, he says, I'm a thinking thing. What kinds of thoughts do I have? What are these thoughts? And he broke them up into different categories. He said there are ideas. Those correspond roughly to things that could be expressed as nouns or noun phrases, like kind of discrete entities, like an idea of God, an idea of dolphins, an idea of water, and so on. And then there are judgments, and judgments are things that can be expressed as, or thoughts that can be expressed as claims, or sometimes you might say propositions, declarative sentences. Judgments are assertions or determinate beliefs about how things are. So a judgment, I might make a judgment that I'm having an idea of a dolphin right now, and I might make a judgment that dolphins exist. There are dolphins in the world. Those are different judgments, okay? So Descartes' point here is that a lot of my ideas they're not in themselves true or false. I just have these ideas in my mind. It's when I come to render judgments about them that I run into the possibility of making an error. Okay, so when I make the judgment, I'm having an idea of a dolphin right now. That's a very fair judgment if I actually do have that idea. It's hard to say that I'm being deceived about that because I'm imagining a dolphin right now. Whereas if I say dolphins really exist in the world, it's much more possible for me to be wrong about that, since it might be that there are no dolphins. Maybe the idea that there are dolphins is a massive hoax. Maybe I'm dreaming and everything that I'm thinking, as he considered in Meditation 1. So the point there is that the point I'm trying to make, and kind of glossing over Descartes' point, is to say that we can use our judgment in different ways for dealing with our ideas. The ideas themselves don't create errors, but it's how we use our judgment that leads to either errors or not errors, getting things right. So that previous passage was a little bit about the faculty of judgment. Remember, Descartes says, I make errors because of the way that that's combined with the faculty of will. So, or sorry, the faculty of intellection, and the way that's combined with the faculty of will. So now here's a little bit more detail about the faculty of will. Descartes writes, the power of willing, which I got from God, is not taken by itself the cause of my errors, for it is most ample as well as perfect in its kind. And a bit earlier on that page, he had compared his own will to God's, and he ends up saying, it seems like God can will anything, and in fact, I also can will anything. The will itself, not considering constraints introduced by what I'm able to think, but just my ability to make a decision, seems to be infinite. So I can't really criticize God for not giving me enough will, for instance. I seem to have been given as much will as anything could be given, more or less total freedom over what I choose to do. Then he goes on to say, nor is my power of understanding the cause of my errors. For since I got my power of understanding from God, whatever I understand, I doubtless understand rightly, and it's impossible for me to be deceived in this. So just understanding itself, or intellection itself, is not the cause of my errors. What then is the source of my errors? Okay, and so then here finally, this is Descartes' account or answer about how it's possible for him to make errors with his judgment. They are owing simply to the fact that since the will extends further than the intellect, I do not contain the will within the same boundaries. Rather, I also extend it to things I do not understand. Because the will is indifferent in regard to such matters, it easily turns away from the true and the good, and in this way I am deceived and I sin. Okay, so a funny way to describe this as like sin. Normally we think of sin as not having to do with like making intellectual mistakes, but that's what Descartes means here. So the idea here is that the scope of the will is nearly infinite. I mean, it's possible for people to decide to do or believe or whatever almost anything. The scope of the understanding is limited because I'm a finite being, so I've only been given as much understanding as I have been given. And Descartes explains this elsewhere in this meditation 4, as he says we can't really fault God for not giving us more understanding than he has because we're finite beings, so we only are given as much as we are. The errors that I get into come from me using my will to extend my judgment further than my understanding actually reaches. So when I make claims about things, when I have an opinion about things, or come to a belief about things that I don't have sufficient understanding of, that I don't see clearly and distinctly to be true. He's going to use that expression again shortly, and that's going to be very important for him. That really is the criterion of good judgment for him. When I come to a conclusion about things that I don't clearly and distinctly perceive to be true, then I run the risk of making mistakes. He says, but if I hold off from making a judgment when I do not perceive what is true with sufficient clarity and distinctness, it is clear that I am acting properly and am not committing an error. But if instead I were to make an assertion or a denial, then I am not using my freedom properly. Were I to select the alternative that is false, then obviously I will be in error. But were I to embrace the other alternative, it will be by sheer luck that I happen upon the truth. But I will still not be without fault, for it is manifest by the light of nature that a perception on the part of the intellect must always precede a determination on the part of the will. So, in other words, he might get things right by forming judgments without having a clear and distinct perception of the truth first. But when he does that, if he gets it right, it will just be a kind of happy accident. It won't be that he actually had a good reason for believing that. And so he still, in a way, is making a mistake, he says. So again, he's recommending, or he's saying that the way to use the judgment properly so that I don't make errors is only to believe things that I clearly and distinctly perceive to be true. So this is the answer to the question, what does it mean to use the faculty of judgment properly? I should only believe what I clearly and distinctly perceive to be true. That's the answer. Let's return now to a question we have been discussing in passing, which is how do we explain the possibility of error consistently with believing that God is all good? We've sort of reached a justification of our beliefs by relying on this claim that there's an all good God who can't be a deceiver. But it's a natural follow-up question. Well, wait, if this is an all good God, why didn't he just make us so we couldn't be wrong about anything? Why did he make us so we even could be wrong? Now, this question is a version of a very famous problem, which is sometimes called the problem of evil. The question is, how can there be an all-good God if the world is imperfect in any way? Because an all-good and an all-powerful God. Because if God is all-good and all-powerful, then it seems like he would have had to have made a perfect world. Why would he make an imperfect world? And certainly an apparently imperfect world. So the fact that we're able to make errors, that we sometimes get things wrong, seems like that's an imperfection. How is that consistent with believing in a perfect God? That's the problem of evil applied to our own beliefs and failures in our own knowledge or our own understanding, errors that we make intellectually. So Descartes' answer is a version of what's sometimes called theodicy, connected with a famous book by that name by a philosopher who comes shortly after Descartes named Leibniz. Theodicy basically means explaining the apparent badness of evil in the world consistently the apparent badness of things in the world consistently with believing in an all-good and all-powerful God. And so there are various techniques of explanation of evil in the world, consistently with belief in God. Here are a few. They're the ones that Descartes offers in this case. So two of the arguments are very general arguments. They can be used anytime you identify any kind of flaw in the world, but you want to defend the existence of God regardless. So one is, we don't know God's purposes. Descartes himself says that. Look, our minds are limited. We're not able fully to understand why God would make us this way, but if he's an all-good God, it must be for the best. The second argument is, we shouldn't consider the rationale for goodness or badness of single things in isolation. It might be that there's some greater perfection in the universe that arises from us being not entirely perfect in regard to our judgment. The next two arguments are much more specific to the case. So one of these is, we can't legitimately complain about our faculty of intellection. It's limited, but all finite things are limited, and we're a finite thing. And our intellection is perfectly good as far as it goes. So as long as we don't overextend our intellection, it's perfectly good. And so in that sense, we don't really have any reason to complain about what we've been given by God. The other argument has to do with our faculty of will. It says we can't legitimately complain about our faculty of will either, because it is basically as broad as God's faculty of will. So we can't really criticize it in any way. It's as powerful as it possibly could be. So again, I don't know whether these will be convincing to you, but I just want to share with you some of the reasons that Descartes gives. And it may be that you can find some other lines of justification here, but I wanted to, in Meditation 4, but I wanted to at least highlight some of the arguments that really stand out the most from the chapter, that are sort of most prominent, to let you know that Descartes is concerned about this and is trying to answer it.